Welcome and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Victor Figueiredo, he, him, él, and I am one of the co-chairs of the 2024 Latinx Conference, as well with Dr. Zulian Nidio here. And both Dr. Zulian Nidio and I are also interim co-directors for the Center for Ethnic Studies Research at UCIS here at the University of Pittsburgh. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome y'all to this conference keynote session entitled No se puede tapar el sol con un dedo. You can't cover the sun with a finger. Keep separate questions on race and ethnicity in federal standards and the urgency of intersectionality as a new vision for advancing equity in Latinx communities. There will be time for Q&A after the keynote, so please hold your questions until then. You're also welcome to drop them in the chat too, and we'll keep track of them. And so at this point, it is my distinct honor to introduce our conference keynote speaker, Dr. Nancy Lopez. Dr. Nancy Lopez is a professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Lopez directs and has co-founded the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. Her scholarship, teaching, and service are guided by the insights of intersectionality, the importance of examining the simultaneity of race, gender, class, ethnicity, and other systems of inequalities across a variety of social outcomes, including education, health, employment, housing, for developing contextualized solutions that advance social justice. Dr. Lopez is the author of Hopeful Girls, Troubled Boys, Race and Gender Disparity in Urban Education. Dr. Lopez is also co-editor of Creating Alternative Discourses in the Education of Latinas and Latinos, Mapping Race, Critical Approaches to Health Disparities Research, as well as Quant Crit, an anti-racist approach to education equity. Dr. Lopez's current research, Intersectionality as Inquiry and Praxis, Race, Gender, Class, Ethnicity for Student Success in STEM, is funded by the NSF HSI program. Dr. Lopez is a Black Latina, New York City-born daughter of Dominican immigrants with a second-grade education rich in cultural wealth. She is the first woman of color tenured in sociology and the first woman of color of the African diaspora tenured in the College of Arts and Sciences and promoted to full professor in 2018 at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Lopez's other current research projects are funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the study on climate for Latino students, employing intersectionality for understanding Latino student success in higher education, the Hewlett Foundation and the WT Grant Foundation for a mixed research project on the impact of high school ethnic studies classes for reducing intersectional inequalities. And Dr. Lopez's current research is also funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for a study on employing and intersectionality framework in revising Office of Management and Budget standards for collecting administrative race and ethnicity data, for illuminating the difference between race and ethnicity, for interrogating inequalities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lopez.
Mil gracias por esa introducción y por la invitación. I'm so grateful to be here in community with all of you, and I'm going to jump in to sharing my slides, and I'm not sure what happened here. Yikes. Can anyone tell me what I should do so that you don't get to see?
Either hit the button that says use slideshow, it should switch it to just the slideshow as opposed to the interview.
Perfect. I knew there was a solution, so thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing to really create opportunities for solidarity within the Latino community, recognizing that we're all Latinos, right? But that our experiences might be very different based on how we are racialized. And I typically read a land acknowledgement, but instead I wanted to just get us to think about our praxis, our action and reflection around land acknowledgements, you know, whether you're at the University of Pittsburgh or you're here in Albuquerque, like myself. So I'm not going to read the title, but just to get you thinking about why it's so important to retain different questions on race and ethnicity in federal guidelines. So I always like to start with a poem to just get us in the mood of community, and this is one that inspires reflection on cultural wealth and critical reflexivity and compassion for action. It's called En la Quech. I am you, you are me, tú eres mi otro yo. Si te hago daño a ti, me hago daño a mí mismo. Si te amo y respeto, me amo y respeto yo. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. And this is a Mayan inspired poem, Pensamiento Serpentino by Luis Valdez, and also recognizing so many organizations out there like Chito, the Latinx Racial Summit, Courageous Conversations, and People's Institute for Survival and Beyond that create these kinds of conversion spaces. So this is my invitation. This is the moment and opportunity for transformative leadership and action, for using intersectionality as inquiry and praxis. And as I continue to talk about it, I want you to jot in the chat what words or images come to mind when you hear the word intersectionality. This is a very brief definition. It comes from Collins and Bilge, and it says, when it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as not being shaped by a single axis of social division, be it race, gender, or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. And this is the nugget for me. People use intersectionality as an analytical tool to solve problems that they or others around them face. So it's really an action tool, right? It's a new vision. It's a normative principle for transformational change. And here, the point that you will hear throughout this conversation is acknowledging that race, gender, class, ethnicity, citizenship status, disability status, sexuality, all of those axes are of inequality, are distinct, means that they require different questions, yet they are simultaneous experiences within systems of oppression in a given context. And here's a little bit on the other work that was already mentioned, so I won't spend much time on this, just to share that most of the work that's funded by different entities engages this kind of praxis, whether we're looking at federal funding or ethnic studies classes in the high schools and the way they reduce inequalities, or creating a community of practice around STEM. So what are my goals today? To really share some of the research where I've used intersectionality to look at invisible differences within equality that would not be seen unless we did intersectionality, and to also talk about, no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo, you can't cover the sun with a finger. We need to keep separate questions on race and ethnicity. And for the Q&A, just to get us thinking, how would analyzing outcomes among Latinos or any other group by race, gender, class, ethnicity as intersecting social locations support your leadership and action? And what are your spheres of influence for advancing this way of thinking? And how would you navigate resistance? And I also invite you to think about, what's your theory of change? I'm hoping that we can share ideas. For me, it's about moving mountains through our values and critical reflection. Here's a email response I got from a program officer about a decade ago when I inquired about applying for many of the grants that you heard mentioned. And his response was, intersectionality is a stand-in for analytical laziness. Perhaps a better way would be to focus on race or gender or class. There are problems with being poor independent of race. There are problems with gender irrespective of race or class. And then ends the email by saying there are plenty of poor white men and women who suffer from serious problems. So this is just to illustrate that there's a lot of misconceptions about intersectionality and sometimes even resistance, and thinking about ways that you can lean in and create critical reflexivity, not only for the person you're interacting with, but maybe it's an institution that is resisting this way of inquiry. This is just a snapshot of my racial social geography, what Ruth Frankenberg in White Women Race Matters calls, like those places that you grew up in. I am Dominican, grew up in public housing in the Lower East Side. I attended de facto segregated schools. That informs a lot of what I research and understand. And I had to fight to take my first Dominican studies course when I was a graduate student because it wasn't formally offered in my graduate program. And I wondered why I had to wait, until I was a graduate student to actually learn something about our history. I have served on over 90 PhD and MA committees, most of them with students who might, like myself, are underrepresented in higher ed. And I also engage in collaborations with my husband, who's a Chicano artist, and has also been a scholar activist. Here is just a brief snapshot of the origins of intersectional thinking. Of course, the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. However, the thinking has preceded the coining of the term, and just a snapshot of some of the many, many Black, Latina, Indigenous, Asian, and white women who have contributed to this form of thinking. And my thought is these women are not lazy, unlike what what the program officer said earlier. So here's a beautiful table that Patricia Hill Collins provides in one of her latest books, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, where she says, intersectionality is a way of asking better questions that always engage these core constructs: relationality, power, social inequality, social context, place, space, history, complexity, social justice, and that these inequalities are complex, right? That race, class, gender, ethnicity, nationality, all of that ability, and that solving problems requires intersectional analysis. Here's a visual that in many ways represents a tool that she gives us that we can apply to Albuquerque, New Mexico, or I can go to South Africa, or I could go to the Dominican Republic or Colombia and say, well, what is that context? What's that past and present systems of inequality that have shaped the present? And then let me look even deeper and look at how power is arranged in the structural domain of power. What do organizational racialized, gendered class politics look like? What about the rules of the game? What about the level of experience at the individual level? And then on the other side, you'll see a circle that represents a cultural domain of power, the hegemonic domain. What are some of those images and stories that we tell? For instance, in higher ed, we often talk about qualified students and unqualified students and who's deserving and who's not. So this tool helps us map intersectionality. Here is an example of an empirical study that I did, and I say got Liberation Capital. Like, I didn't wait for the funding. I found co-collaborators who were interested in learning, can we make invisible inequalities in higher ed when we look at race, gender, and class together. And of course, this way of thinking, Lisa Boleg has constantly reminded us that investigation of statistical interactions and quantitative research is necessary. We have to analyze these findings in a macro socio-historical context, and that numbers don't speak for themselves, right? Only within a framework of interpretation created by the researcher. And Covarrubias in 2011 talks about quantitative intersectionality, and points out that to capture the nuance of our intersecting systems of oppression, how they are acted upon us, how they affect us, how it's a structuring structure, but we resist these structures, right? To explain how this happens in a given context. So what we did was, in keeping with this way of thinking, we said we wanted to look at the odds of graduating. These are not graduation rates. These are what are the odds, the probabilities of graduating within 6 years at a large public university in the Southwest that will remain nameless according to the Institutional Review Board. And what we find is that when we look at outcomes by intersectional social locations, all of a sudden you see stuff that was invisible. And all of the social locations in red are people who, like me, grew up in a very low income household. And you see that the disparities could range for American Indians from 45 to 40% less likely to graduate than high income white women, to white and Asian women that had the lowest disparity, but it was still disparity 14%. So again, locate yourself here. What social location? Think back to when you were 16, 18 years old. Where would you be? And when you look at Latinos, I want you to note that Latinos at the time were not being collected by Hispanic ethnicity and race separately. So there was no way for me to know if these odds are different for Black Latinos like myself or cousins of mine that are white Latinos and everything else in between. But again, it does give you an idea of the value of intersectionality. I also want to highlight that zip code and school attended are not a proxy for class. And I show these two images because on the right is the public housing project where I grew up, and on the left across the street were co-ops that actually were sued for discriminating against visible minorities when I was in high school. So again, think about how these are the same zip code, but if we don't have something like parent level of education, these inequalities will remain invisible. So here I'm showing you graduation rates. These are 5-year graduation rates cohort. So these are not probabilities. And again, I highlight first generation college women like myself, all in yellow, whether they're Black, Hispanic, white, Native American, or Asian, we see major differences in cohort graduation. From 26% graduating for Black and Indigenous to 38 for Hispanic and 65 and 44 for Asian and white. So what would you tell an administrator or legislator who says, nah, we don't want to ask about parent level of education. That's too, it's impolite. We have too many questions. It's an invasion of privacy. I did actually co-author, I helped facilitate and catalyze a statewide bill to collect this data from preschool to grad school to, again, make the invisible visible. So, before I switch into the census and the OMB, I just want you to reflect on the difference between transformative intersectionality and performative intersectionality, meaning a lot of people claim they're aware about intersectionality, but where's the action, right? So how has the process of engaging in intersectionality policy-based analysis transformed your thinking about relations and structures of power, policy development, your own critical reflexivity, and the ways in which you're always paying attention to history, context, and place? So like, for instance, when I shared the data on American Indians, knowing what settler colonial violence has done to American Indians in the Southwest, but throughout the country is incredibly important for contextualizing what we found, right? The lowest odds of graduating, right? So here's a visual that comes from Hukinski, where she and her colleagues share with us what intersectional based policy analysis could look like. It is looking at social statuses, multi-level analysis. It's always looking at power. It's always involving this critical reflection on yourself, right? And the history and the context, space, embracing diverse knowledges, the cultural wealth, and social justice and equity. Here's a policy analysis that I shared with legislatures in my state, where I point out that our funding formula for institutions of higher ed assumes that income alone or Pell status alone, whether or not you qualify for financial aid, is sufficient to address the racial gap in education. And we know that that is not the case. I showed data that shows that that's not the case. So instead, an alternative would be to embrace intersectionality and say, the use of race, gender, and class as analytically distinct and simultaneous social locations is necessary for identifying at-promise students. And here I challenge that language that calls, Pell status students or any student who's considered racial minority, quote unquote, at risk. That's deficit language. So what if we cultivate communities of practice with an ethical and professional commitment to confront and improve these intersecting locations? I want to invite you all to join our listserv. If you go to HSI intersectionality.com, you'll not only find videos of these amazing presenters, Dr. Alvero and Dr. Irisari, who are leading the way in intersectional analysis in higher ed for Latinos, and showing that if we just assume that Latinos are a monolith, we're missing an opportunity to make equity lifts possible. So we also hold free monthly office hours for anyone who wants to embrace this. This is our NSF grant, which is taking place with CUNY, 3 institutions in New York, in New Mexico and New York. We are creating faculty fellows who will be leaders for action in their departmental units in STEM. and to create an action plan, right? To cultivate this community of practice. What does this mean in curriculum? What does this mean for internships? What does this mean for pedagogy? What does this mean in equity metrics, right? And how do we change the narrative? So you can visit that website. So what is our challenge? You know, just to summarize before we switch to the other topic, intersectionality is constantly acknowledged as a buzzword. There's this performative awareness, but little engagement with the foundational texts, theories, and praxis. We argue that race, gender, class, ethnicity, and parent level of education must be a gold standard for baseline equity metrics, analysis, reporting, pedagogy, mentoring, community collaborations, and other allocations of resources, not only in Hispanic serving institutions, but in every institution. So again, what is our theory of change? What are our values? Attention to power, do no harm, constantly engaging in self-critique and self-reflexivity at the individual level, at the institutional level, and embracing intersectionality as praxis. Here's a challenge that we have in higher ed right now. So for the most part, all institutions of higher ed and beyond, K-12 as well, have to report, even if they collect race and ethnicity as separate, right? They have to report Latino or Hispanic outcomes as a monolith, as an aggregate. And that really impedes our ability to know whether or not there's discipline gaps by race within a Latino school or within Latino students. And right now, I don't know how many of you are aware, but there was an article that recently came out in Inside Higher Ed that is talking about a proposed legislation that would just limit the data collection, demographic data collection in higher ed to only students who receive financial aid, veterans, and other, students who are receiving financial aid. That would be horrific for intersectional analysis and for really holding our institutions accountable for who they are serving and who they're not serving. So if you're interested, check out that article that came out in February in Inside Higher Ed, and also think about how you would respond to arguments that we don't want to collect this data because it's an invasion of privacy. Well, all of these data, institutional data, can be de-identified. No one needs to know anyone's birth date or address. It could be used to make visible who we're serving and who we're not. And of course, we could put in safeguards like reporting data only for cell sizes of 10 or above. So imagine if we engaged in what Gina Garcia in her latest book, Transforming HSIs for Equity, calls freedom dreaming coupled with intersectionality. The freedom, transforming HSI's framework will require members internal to the organization and partners external to the organization to fulfill the dream, the freedom to dream, to transform higher ed, and to implement pedagogies to decolonize the institution and disrupt and decouple whiteness, and to challenge the racialized institution to create new approaches to liberatory education at the post-secondary level. All right, so now we are going to do our deep dive. I love this image because it reminds us of the cultural wealth of our familias, right? There's beautiful refranes and dichos and beautiful cultural wealth that really gives us insight into injustice and a way forward, a transformative future. So, no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo. You can't cover the sun with a finger. It is absurd that right now our federal guidelines are considering coupling or combining and conflating race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity are both social constructions. They have no genetic, biological, or innate component, but they're not equivalent and they're not concordant. Ethnicity refers to a social position in society that is about your cultural heritage. So there are several of us here probably that are Dominican or Puerto Rican or Colombian or Mexican, etc. That's our cultural heritage. That's beautiful. And thank goodness that we all have different histories and culture. That's what our cultural wealth is about. But that says zero about our racial status. Race is a social position in society that has a visual, ocular, corporeal component, and it has a long history. And for us to pretend that these two things are co-equal, or that they can be collected in a meaningful way statistically in one question, is what I call statistical gaslighting. I love this quote from my colleague who actually retired from the Census, amazing leader and applied demographer, Dr. Howard Hogan, who says, if you don't know what you're measuring, any question's going to do. So again, Flag has talked about the transparency phenomenon, this idea that especially among Latinos, but others, we think that race doesn't apply because we're all part of this monolith, but we are all Latinx people, right? Anyone on this call could be Latinx or not, but for those of us who are of Latino origin, regardless of what we look like or our specific ethnicity, we are Latinos, right? However, whether we go to Latin America, the Caribbean, Spain, or the US, or anywhere across the globe, there is a preponderance of evidence. It's not just Nancy Lopez's research that shows that race as a visual status shapes experience, opportunity structures for Latino communities and families, and ignoring that reality is not going to help us advance equity in voting or in housing or employment or criminal justice, etc., or education. Why are we embracing historical amnesia? I think we need to do a racial reckoning within the Latino community. Privilege obfuscates some realities. This is a beautiful quote that comes from a book called it's Blacks, Mulattoes, and the Dominican Nation. It's from Franklin Franco. And he's quoting the governor of the Dominican Republic in 1820. He says, our population is made up of different colors and conditions. There are white people, there are dark-skinned people, there are Black people. And among these last two groups, there are free people and there are slaves. That doesn't mean a slave is no longer a slave or that persons of color are suddenly on the level with white citizens. They all remain subject to the laws and responsibilities of their status, class, and position. This again reminds us why we have to pay attention to history and recognize that we are still living in this history. So I'm sure you all know about Brown versus the Board of Ed, and you probably also know that before that there was a case on school segregation in 1946, the Mendez-Westminster. And on the left, you'll see Silvia Mendez, who was told, no, you cannot register in this school. And on the right, you'll see the two girls, I'm not talking about the little boy, who were her cousins, but were lighter skinned and were told they could enroll. So the idea that Latinos have been treated as a racial monolith is not based in history, not in Latin America, not here. And so I use this quote from some of the ethnic studies teachers we've been talking to in terms of what they've observed. And one indicated that brown skin Latino students in their classes are telling them that people are yelling at them, telling them to go back to where they came from and trying to run over them in their trucks. We hear constant stories about how race as a visual social status is shaping the experiences with violence, with discrimination for Latinos, and now we want to pretend that Latinos are all the same race. These quotes come from Omi and Wanat's Racial Formation in the United States that again highlight that point that racial formation has a visual component, that it includes skin color, physical build, hair texture, the structure of cheekbones, the shape of nose, and that this racialization process, who's considered an undocumented immigrant and who's considered a US citizen, is taking place through these phenotypic associations. They provide this beautiful visual, or I created a visual that was inspired by their theory that talks about racial projects, definitions, interpretations, and representations of racial dynamics that are tied to the allocation of resources. And for me, this attempt to conflate race and ethnicity is a color and power evasive racial project that's happening at the level of the census. So how is it that we will respond? So this is really just highlighting how race is a social construction that happens at the macro level, whether we're talking about social movements, mass media, what's being, the myth of, Latinos as a monolith and what's happening in the census, but it's also in our organizations and it's also experienced at the individual level. This beautiful quote comes from Bacazin and Zambrana, two sociologists who are intersectional leaders, and they talk about cautioning that the term Latino, Latina is a social construct that must be problematized, that is complicated by differences in national origin, citizenship, race, class, and ethnicity, and by the confluence of those factors, an intersectional approach acknowledges these differences and seeks to reveal and understand how they shape social experience. When it comes to the term Latinas, it's not a unitary term that homogenizes distinctive heritage groups, but, and this is my nugget, as a term of implicit solidarity with other U.S. groups with a Spanish colonial history and genealogical, political, cultural, and ethnic ties to Latin America. Here's a tool that I often use to say, I didn't create colorism, and if I am the darkest skinned Black woman in any social space, there is a problem, right? I didn't create heterosexism, ableism, all of these isms, right, that we know. But I'm located in these systems, and I need to critically reflect what that means for my critical praxis, right? And again, just highlighting race and ethnicity are not concordant. We need a both and approach, and that's what intersectionality offers us so that we could resist this ontological flattening, this theory of reality that race and ethnicity are concordant. So here's a beautiful visual that, again, I love to represent other people's work through visuals. And this is Yerval Davis, who has a wonderful book on the politics of belonging. And she makes very clear that the domains of belonging are analytically distinct and they are also not concordant. So we talked about our intersectional social location, whether it's tribal status, race, gender, ethnicity, class. That's one thing, right? That's our intersectional social location. Now, the stories we tell about that may be very different. We could grow up in the same family and identify as a Black Latina, regardless of what we look like, and have a very different national, narrative of identity. And that in no way tells you what your ethical and political commitments are in terms of anti-Blackness, right? So you could be a Black Latina and still embrace internalized racist narratives about Black Latinos, and you could be a white Latina and embrace liberatory narratives and praxis and action and reflection. So again, just pointing out that a social status and identity narrative is not the same. These are different domains of belonging, right? Here's the work that I collaborated on with my husband, who is an artist, a curator, and someone who has been often racialized as either Mexican or in some cases Navajo or Dene, meaning Native American, or even Filipino, i.e. brown, right? A visible minority, right? So we thought, let's collaborate on a work that joins sociology and art, and we invited 20 artists to talk about how street race has affected their praxis. And so we asked, what's your street race? If you were out in the street and in public, what race do you think others who do not know you would assume you are automatically based on what you look like? And we wanted people to reflect on their lived experiences and how relationships of power shape their identity. And if people say, well, it depends on the street, or I'm racially mixed, I'm ambiguous, consider how race is relational. In relation to whom? How could critical reflection about race as relational and differential racialization advance your inquiry and praxis around liberatory futures? And think about those who have experienced anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, Asian hate, based on the visual component of race. So here's another visual. All of these men are Latinx. They probably had ancestors that walked all over the globe, but why would it be useful to mark only one box when it comes to discerning who's experiencing residential segregation, who's being asked for extra papers when they go vote, and who is going to be treated, differently when they show up in an ER with the same symptoms, right? So I make the point, family members, especially in Latinx communities, of the same group, biologically, they are the same group. They should answer that race question differently to reflect their unique racial status. So the street race concept always has gender in it, because we know gendered anti-Blackness looks very different than gendered, gendered anti-indigeneity, that it has to do with racialization, intersectionality, that we're collecting this data not because we want to be nosy, but because we want to know civil rights outcomes, and that we always have to pay attention to history. Here is just a snapshot of some of the peer-reviewed research that I've published using the street race measure that makes clear that when we just collect self-identity and don't interrogate how others are seeing you, then we miss an opportunity to make visible discrimination in voting, housing, when you go shopping in the store, when you seek medical care, or if you're experiencing mental health inequities. And this bottom, and these were published in the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Critical Public Health, but this other report was a collaboration with the Urban Institute, which is the first empirical study to include Brown as an analytical category for Latinos. And we found that when you don't provide that, most Latinos will just say I'm Latino, but when you do provide it, 1 in 5 Latinos chose that, and that maps onto inequities that remain invisible otherwise. Here is another quote from my colleague Yasmin Irizarry, where she says, you know, the consequences of treating Latino as a racial category are problematic because it positions categories such as white, Native, Asian, and Black as being separate from, different from being Latino, and that's ahistorical. So how could intersectionality and praxis change that conversation? I point out that I was at a national conference of Latinos, and there was a panel, a woman who probably would have been racialized as East Indian, and she prefaced her comments by saying, I'm not Latina, and people laughed. And I started thinking to myself, what does that mean? So that if someone so-called doesn't look Latino, then we have to laugh because they're not part of our family? What kind of nonsense is that, right? So what are the limits of thinking about who's visually centered when we talk about Latinidad? Here's a beautiful quote, that unsolicited email that I received after I gave a presentation on street race. And this woman says, I attended this lecture, and as someone whose street race is white, but has a grandmother who immigrated from Latin America, it made me think about my own journey and understanding my relationship to race and ethnicity. It's something that I'm beginning to grapple with, and has caused a fair amount of discomfort as well as excitement. I was hoping that you had book recommendations. So to me, this means instead of saying, oh, I hate this street race concept because you're saying I'm not Latina because I'm white. No, or because I'm racialized as white. I'm saying this is an invitation to critical reflection, to practicing that implicit solidarity, right? Here's just a snapshot of all the research that shows that race is a meaningful social status within Latinidad, right? Whether you show up to vote, who's asked for extra papers, whether you seek employment, whether you are being sentenced for the same crime, or you are accessing healthcare, or even what neighborhood you live in. It matters, right? Black Latinos and those who are not racialized as white have experienced inequities at much different rates, right? And so this report on the right was one I co-authored with UCLA that utilized the American Community Survey that comes from the Census, and discovered that despite having higher levels of education, and especially for Black Latinas like myself, higher levels of labor force participation when compared to Black women who are not Latina or Latinas who are not Black, we have higher poverty rates and lower home ownership. We couldn't even use the 2021 data because of the changes that happened in the 2020 census. So again, we're already witnessing the erasure of race data when you combine race and ethnicity. So this is from the 2010 census, and you'll see that the census claims, look, so many Latinos, they don't see themselves, but they've never tested any categories that are meaningful for Latinos who are not racialized as white or Black. And so to say that to me is, again, another example of statistical racial gaslighting. And the truth is that there is clear differences by national origin. So yes, for Mexican and Puerto Ricans, half of Latinos identify as white. For Cubans, it's 85%. Dominicans have among the lowest, only 30%. But for South Americans, it's about 2/3. So obviously that has some resonance, right? Those categories. Here I share a table from Saenz and Morales' amazing book, Latinos in the United States, Diversity and Change, where they show that even when you do this intersectional analysis that includes ethnicity, place of birth, and gender, you see that overall Mexicans have lower levels of college attainment than, for instance, Colombians, right? But if we radically contextualize that, we'll understand that there's a very different history there. But I also ask the question, how do we make disaggregated data inseparable from intersectionality? So the question I would ask is, are US-born first-generation Black Colombian women earning college degrees at the same rates as their white, brown, and other Colombian counterparts, even if they're US-born, right? Think about their relational lived experiences in the classroom. Are they going to be the same? I hope they are, but our research shows that that's not the case. whether they're in internships or in the workplace. And I think you will remember that Ilia Calderon, Black Colombian woman immigrant, she was not US born, who went to interview a white nationalist KKK member, I believe, and first just called and said, a Latina is coming. There was no problem. But the minute she showed up, her life was threatened. She's a Black Latina, right? So just thinking about the lived reality, right? Even with high levels of education of Black Latina women. So here I will show you the census form in 2000, which had on the left, is this person Hispanic? I could check yes and write in Dominican. My husband would write in Chicano, and our daughters would write in both. And then what's this person's race? As I mentioned before, my husband would have nothing to check because the census has never, in spite of many recommendations, included alternative categories that are meaningful for Latinos. But this is what happened in 2020 for the first time in the history of our nation. We kept the separate Hispanic origin question, but guess what happened? We added origins to distinct racial boxes. And I asked the census, where would you put Canadian? What about South African? What does it mean when you are linking a national origin to a race box? Are we implying that some races are more representative of a nation? Is absolutely problematic and absurd and unethical if you are telling people mark one or more and print origins, and not telling them that when I marked, yes, I am Dominican, and then I marked Black, and I wrote in Dominican, I now disappear into the 2 or more box. So they did say this was going to happen about a month before they went into the field. But how many people, I want to ask, how many of you saw this when you were marking the census? There was no way of people really knowing what was going to happen with that data that's used for voting redistricting, that's used for determining, segregation and all of these other civil rights outcomes, right? So I urge you to watch this video and hear how people were asking questions after that webinar that were never answered. Meaning how nonsensical is it for us to reallocate people after the fact without telling them at the point of data collection that now they were joining the 2 or more race category. So the proposals that are coming out of the Office of Management and Budget, as you know, to combine race and ethnicity in one question. And of course, this created an explosion. 2 or more was the second largest racial group. And guess what? If this goes through, which they're going to make their announcement probably by this summer, we will now have 2 or more as the biggest racial group. This will happen. And all of a sudden, segregation is going to disappear, racialized poverty is going to disappear, all of those civil rights outcomes, because everyone's 2 or more. It's important to note that this is not the first time. These guidelines have been around since the 1970s, but in the 1990s, the American Anthropological Association sent a memo to the Office of Management and Budget saying, please go ahead forward with this combined race and ethnicity question so that eventually we will eliminate the word race from our data collection. So why has there been such a push to test census questionnaires without the word race? Why did these tests not include a single civil rights outcome? There's a long history, right? So the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s passed. In 1970, the census no longer used the word color with race at all. Color no longer mattered. I mentioned the OMB memo that the Anthropological Association said there used to be separate committees for Spanish origin, for Native American, for African American, for Asian American. And they're like, nope, we don't need that anymore. And there were active attempts to dismantle these committees, and they effectively did. And then the census in 2010 and 2015 did 2 studies. And these studies were not conclusive, but are being used again to indicate support for this combined question. I think this saying at the National Archive is so powerful that past this prologue. And I have about 5 more minutes and I will be done. So I want you to think, what explains these proposals to combine race and ethnicity? They're old. They have been around for a long time. And what are the social forces that shape the definition of race? Why did the word color disappear from data collection, after 1970, after we passed the Civil Rights Act? Why didn't we test a single outcome like housing segregation when we're testing these formats, right? And why haven't the census ever tested, even though, like I said, these advisory committees have said, if Latinos want to check the word brown or use the, why haven't they tested it? Or mestizo claro, mestizo oscuro, etc. And why not include other measures of race, like how you're seen, street race, because we know that's the basis of discrimination. What if intersectionality were used for shaping the future of data collection? So I've been doing this research. It's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with Dr. Yasmin Irizarry, Edward Vargas, and a whole suite of researchers. And what are we finding? That there's a complete disregard of the use of civil rights for this data, that the Spanish in origin communities and actively were not listened to. They were ignored, a lot of their recommendations. And they did fight back, and I'm hoping that that will continue. So here I'm just going to share with you some of the quotes that we found in the archives. And this is in the 1980s. This is the planning committee, and it says, if Hispanics wanted to report brown in the race question, let them do it. And the constant message was from Latinos who were not Black, most of them would be considered probably mestizo or even white, that precede the race and origin questions with a general clarifying instruction. Tell them what you're collecting, and that was never done. And the census still says Hispanics have a great difficulty in responding to the race question. This is one of the reasons that we want to, combine. But they've never, like I said, tested. I mentioned that this is part of, statistical gaslighting, or what I call aesthetic accuracy. This idea we're not going to erase race data and everyone will just check that they're Hispanic, and neglecting to say at the moment of data collection that you will be recoded, not clarifying that this is used for voting redistricting and looking at poverty rates and program development, all of that. So we need instead intersectional, authentic accuracy, separate questions on race and ethnicity, and making sure that, rigorous research is actually happening. So here's the areas in green in this map that were used to test the question on race in 2015 in the national content test for Latinos. And none of these areas, and now I have 2 minutes, none of these areas included the Northeast, where the vast majority of Black Latinos are located, at least the strata that was targeted for testing the Latino question. So there were a lot of problems with the testing. And like I said, this was done over 10 years ago, and they were saying, oh no, conclusively, we found no differences for Black Latinos, which is absolutely problematic. Here we see how the race data has changed across time, and how there've been different tests and how these evolve. These are some of the social forces, social institutions, whether it's the census, whether it's the federal technical working groups in the OMB and the scholarly associations. All of these folks are shaping how race is being collected from the 1960s on. And I ask, why do you think census tests on race and ethnicity were decoupled from outcomes just, since 2010? Here's some other quotes from the 1980s and 70s from the Spanish origin community. Use two identifiers instead of one. Locate the Spanish identifier before the race and color. So there was complete unanimity in the Spanish origin committee that advised the census in the 70s that these should be separate questions. There was even a call in the 1970s from Vilma Ortiz, who was the chair, saying, we want a National Academy studies on the scientific study of race for understanding inequality. We're still waiting 4 decades later. That has never been done. They've done it on race and genomics. They've done it on sexuality and gender, but never have they done one on race and ethnicity and measuring inequality. Here's another quote from Puente Duani, speaking truth to power, meaning that, pointing out that here we are, the Spanish origin committee making recommendations that are consistently ignored by the census about keeping separate questions on race and ethnicity. And here he summarizes one of the major battles of the 1980 Census Origin Advisory Committee with the Bureau staff was with regard to the need for a separate question on Spanish origin as opposed to mixing it with race or nationality. We're still fighting that fight. Here, imagine what flexible solidarity could look like. And this quote is too long to read, but it just symbolizes that the argument that was being made at the time is we need to keep these committees, and the census was dismantling them. And that the fact that Latinos were there from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from the Southeast, from all different national origins, etc., meant that there was a lot of struggle, but there was consensus. There was that beautiful implicit solidarity that concluded we need to separate questions. So I'll end. Race evasiveness is not anti-racism. Anti-racism begins with the understanding the institutional nature of racial matters and accepting that everyone, no one's exempt. It's not just Black Latinos that are being racialized or brown Latinos that are being racialized. It's all of us are being racialized, right? And that we're affected materially and ideologically by the racial structure. I also love this quote from Charles Mills, The Racial Contract, and he says, to the extent that, quote, race is assimilated to, quote, ethnicity, white supremacy remains unmentioned. That's a powerful nugget. And so what is our argument? We must do no harm. We must keep separate questions on race and ethnicity. We must call for a moratorium on any proposed changes that conflate those. Will your organization send a letter? See the letters that we have crafted as part of our work. And those are available on my sociology website at the UNM webpage. There's a consensus memo and a methods memo with necessary research, and these are co-authored with, again, Yasmin Irizarry and Edward Vargas. We must call for a national consensus study, ongoing, and archival research on the social construction of race across time, and we must create a community of practice. I thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to this dialogue about how we can act in solidarity, what Patricia Hill Collins calls flexible solidarity, to ensure a more just future for everyone. With that, I'll end. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. That was an amazing just presentation. You left us with so much to just to think about, to dialogue about here. And yeah, let's transition to Q&A. And so please, anyone here, if you can drop a question in the chat, or you can also unmute yourselves as well, or raise your virtual hand. Either one works. I'll keep track as much as I can. But yeah, any questions at this point that folks may have at the moment?
Did anybody reflect on how they answered their 2020 census and how they may have been reallocated without their knowledge? Or has anyone used intersectionality in looking at outcomes in your work?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Doctora Lopez. Thank you for your presentation. Let me turn on my camera, sorry. My name is Sara Rivera. I work in a private 4-year predominantly white institution. I work in student services as an administrator. And I work with the predominantly Latinx identifying community on campus in all aspects, students, faculty, and staff. My question is, how can we continue to fight for this? Because I feel like it is a fight, especially with these news articles and media talking about the erasure of DEI offices altogether, right? If offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion are being eliminated, and there's all, you know, and works and books and all these things, how can we continue to fight the fight and do the work? That's my question. Yeah.
Let me say that there's so many opportunities. So for instance, I mentioned I do work with ethnic studies high school teachers, right? And we created a research practice partnership with the local school district. And I'm also doing this research with other colleagues in California, in San Francisco, and in LA, and here in Albuquerque. So one way is by creating new knowledge about the impact of these courses, pedagogy, curriculum, and harmonizing that with the stated mission. So if our institutions are claiming that they're here to support our students and to ensure student success, one way of doing it is by interest convergence and say, okay, so you claim that you want to make sure, here are the inequities that we're seeing when we look at race, gender, ethnicity, remembering that all Latinos are not the same race, and parent level of education, remembering that based on, you know, our relative relational class status, there may be different outcomes. So now that we see these visible inequities, how are we going to make sure that things like ethnic studies, things like mentoring and, you know, centering the cultural wealth and creating community-facing engagement is happening under our four walls? So we fight with pointing out what I don't know how many of you have seen Victor Ray's article on racialized organizations, and he talks about four tenets, right? Like the unequal distribution of power and resources, how whiteness becomes a credential, and how oftentimes the stated goals to serve all students and to advance success are decoupled from what's happening on the ground. So using that and pointing out where you can actually get more money. Like I got a $3 million grant from where? The National Science Foundation to use intersectionality for student success. That's going to include new research that's going to be published, but it's also going to change and create leaders and faculty fellows and others who are going to champion what needs to happen in each unit. So I think finding ways of making the interests converge. I hope that answers it. I also talked about the statewide bill to collect parent level of education. We were not successful. We introduced that last year. However, we're going to try again and again show that without this data, we don't know who we're serving. Just knowing race and gender is not enough. We also have to have some measure of class, socioeconomic status. We're not going to get income from everybody. That's impossible. But we can get parent level of education when you were 16 and use that data to see who we're serving. But don't give up. Do not give up. There's so many opportunities. Sometimes it means showing up at the school board. Sometimes it means meeting with state legislators and sharing the research that shows why this matters. That is not just about a publication. It's about action and distribution of resources.
Can I jump in with a question building on that? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. That was just great context, and I relate to you very deeply. I'm also an Afro-Latina Dominican from New York City, from the Bronx, to be specific. So I was over here cheering for you. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Also low income, that, you know, just similar identities. And so I'm so happy and inspired to see you here with us this afternoon. I guess my question, in some ways, as Sarah asked her question, it made me think, building on that, what we saw in 2016 and what we're seeing this year, being election years, is that what it came down to vote-wise with the Latinos, the Latinx population, right? We made up a significant portion of votes one way or the other. And so it's interesting to me in some ways how we got there, how we seem so divided. I think a lot of that came through in your presentation. I think in my mind, some of that boils down to race and class, as you were saying. But I'd love to hear you talk about, you know, politically, how do you think we got here as Latinos, and how can we, and how can we, if so, galvanize for this election year to make sure that we're thinking on behalf of all of us, like Latinos and Latinx? What can we do? I think there was a lot of divisiveness that I was surprised by in 2016 when they revealed how votes went. And thinking about this year, and it's a very heavy year, and what more can we do with all going on to make sure that we're advocating on behalf of the collective?
I think looking at the past is important, because one of the things that I didn't get to really flesh out, because I was trying to present like 3 presentations in one, was a lot of flexible solidarity that was happening. So let me give you one quick example. Around the 1980 census, there was a fight that the Spanish origin advisory committee to the census had, because they had excluded any testing where I was born, actually the zip code I was born in. So south of Houston Street, the Lower East Side, basically. And they're like, no, 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 no. You may not go forward with your testing until you include here, because these are different Latinos than the ones in Texas or the ones in California. So there's evidence to me that there was flexible solidarity. I attended the Latina Futures Conference recently at UCLA. It was in January. And Vilma Martinez, who was one of the co-chairs, was there. She's 80. And let's just say she is still transforming and doing amazing things. So one example she gave was that when the renewal for the Voting Rights Act was up, there was an attempt to add Mexican Americans, Latinos to that, but some members of the African American community were worried about that, because they said this might unravel the whole thing. While other members of the African American community, the Asian community, the Native American community were like, no, we need to be in solidarity. So I think learning this history is important, and recognizing that when we critically reflect on our history and on our differential racialization, and then shift to understand how the experiences of a different person, a different group, a different history and time period is connected to us, that we can actually move mountains. We can actually create that solidarity, those alliances that were necessary. So Vilma Martinez said, when asked, and she's 80 again, she was general counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, in her 30s. So she's been at this for a very long time. And she said, my biggest accomplishment was getting the 100% count on the census. That took solidarity from all the other advisory groups to get that done. And again, if we focus on our history, we can actually look for those moments that inspire us to overcome what we're seeing right now, and say, there is a history of white supremacy and how different groups have worked together, including white folk who were co-conspirators, to dismantle efforts to stop the vote, to dismantle efforts to continue discriminating in housing and education. So again, I think, yeah, the past is prologue, like you'll see in the. So I feel hopeful, believe it or not. I really do, because I am seeing all those moments of coalition building and solidarity. But we don't know that history. Until I was digging in the archives, I would never have known that history.
Right, exactly. No, thank you. And I appreciate that. I was so surprised at like how they were able to attack different, not attack, but like almost capitalize on the Latinx community depending on race and all these different things, and seeing and like kind of sway the vote in that way, and just how divided we really were. I was like, this is illuminating. Yeah.
Well, that refrán, no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo, could be used anywhere, not just with the census. And I think the same is true with some of the, what's the word, false news and alternative facts. It's like, you can't cover the sun with a finger. This is real. This is what happened, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing, the truth telling with our cultural wealth.
Yeah, gracias.
De nada.
Thank you, Sarah and Bianca, for your questions. I just want to go through a couple questions in the chat for you, Dr. Lopez. So Luana is asking, Luana says, thank you for this amazing presentation. My question is, what is the place of Brazil, Black Brazilians, especially in this intersectional perspective of Latinidad?
It is something that needs to be made visible, right? Anti-Blackness has no national boundaries, right? And so the census, there was a scandal because so many Brazilians, I'm not remembering the percentage, but it's a very high percentage who did check they are Hispanic. They were recoded out of that category, right? And so again, without their knowledge. So one thing that could happen is that, and I know the Afro-Latino Forum in New York is working on this, is to work in solidarity and make sure that those experiences are not erased statistically or even in terms of policy, right? The experiences of anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, everything, anti-Asianness, Asian hate is visited on Brazilians as much as any other Latino. So how are we going to change that? It's going to take coalition and alliance. But there have been several articles pointing out that that invisibility needs to end. So yeah, an intersectional perspective applies equally, right? Every critique I made about how Latinos are treated as a monolith applies to Brazilians, obviously, and any other group. It's not simply ethnic and cultural heritage is not race. And everyone is racialized, no matter if you're German. I've been to Germany. There are Germans who look like many of us on this call that are Black, right? And so for us to pretend that, oh, white and German. So if someone marks that they are Black and German, no, they must be two or more. What? That is nonsensical. Race and ethnic origin or nationality are not concordant. They're different things, require different questions to understand that category of experience. Black Germans I spoke to have had very different experience than their cousins who are white Germans or anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. And I mean, that really also highlights the importance of street race, as you were talking about it in your presentation, and how if we only have data on self-reported race and not street race, how do we know our people are racialized and how that's impacting their current circumstances? And so I just wanted to say
And there
that.
are a
And
lot of people who embrace the Afro-Latino narrative, and I think that's beautiful to say, see, mi abuela era, or whatever, even my mom is, but they are visually not subjected to anti-Blackness. So in solidarity, how will you answer that race question?
Mm.
That's the thing. So it's one thing to embrace your identity, but then to know that that data is being used to know that when you show up to look for an apartment, you're going to be treated the same as your mom, who looks like Michelle Obama, as my mom has always been told, oh, you look like Michelle Obama, right? Every other dark-skinned Black woman, right? And so recognizing that that experience may be very different for another Afro-Latina who is visually not phenotypically racialized as Black. Like, for instance, I've been at my university for 23 years, and I've been called the name of almost every other Black woman faculty, because supposedly we look alike.
I'm gonna thank you, Dr. Lopez. I'm gonna go on to the next question. Jenna Floyd is asking, I have a question. I'm an advisor and sometimes helps students navigate applications, FAFSA. Some Latina students I work with resist answering the race question. Do you have recommendations to help educate and encourage self-reflection in quick moments where I may only have a few minutes with a student?
Maybe use a story from your own life, and maybe have them reflect on a story from their own life and say, well, you know, we're all cousins. So let me give an example. I was at a Latino museum in New York, and I had just come from an Afro-Latino forum event, and I was wearing my t-shirt with Africa and South America and the Caribbean superimposed. And the security guard, who looks very much like a Afro-Latino like me or my brother, would say, oh, that's really interesting. Where are you coming from? And I said, oh, we're having this conference on potential changes to the census. And he says, well, if we really want to know someone's race, you should just take a DNA test. And I said, this has really nothing to do with your DNA. What it has to do with is, are your cousins that look like you and me, or the ones who might look white or something else, going to be treated the same way when they look for an apartment? Oh, street race, I get it. So using the example of, we're not collecting this because we want to be nosy. We want to make sure that all of our familias are being treated well, that all of our cousins and our siblings and partners, whoever, are being treated equitably and fairly. So that I think storytelling helps a lot. And that they shouldn't be afraid that this data are de-identified. So like all those studies that we've done, it's not like I can say fulano and fulana, this is their graduation rate. No, it's all de-identified data. I love Danielle's question, and I'll
Yeah.
read.
Mm-hmm.
Are there countries or cities that are admirable for their methods of collecting data on intersectional identities? Frankly, I wish there were more. And I know that across Latin America, like Colombia, I think has improved the way they collect race data. So they're really making sure that they're not conflating. But the truth is we need more of it. And I think the United States is strategically positioned to do that because we know we've had that, that separate Spanish origin identifier since the 80s. So we have decades of research that shows, I showed some of that, but that's about to go away because once they conflate, you can't go back. Garbage in, garbage out. So I hope that there are more countries doing this, but as far as I know, right now there aren't that many. And I want to make the point that afrodescendiente is not the same as street race Black. These are different things. I think everyone on this call probably has an African ancestor, right? Like probably. To say I have an ancestor that is of the African diaspora, probably most of us do. Probably, right? But is that the same as saying that you are street race Black or treated or subjected to anti-Blackness? No. So how are you going to answer that question in solidarity? I will never tell anyone you must mark this, but I want you to reflect on the consequences of what you mark. And the reality is you can't count twice for population counts. So if you are saying, I want to embrace all of these ancestry, which is great, but for the race question, which is used to determine segregation, voting rights, and you mark 5 boxes, you're going to go into 2 or more, even if you mark 2. So guess what? Obama was harassed in 2010 because he marked 1 box. He put Black. And people are like, you're denying your mom who's white, etc. And I'm like, he's a lawyer. He understands what this data are about. There is a separate ancestry question on the American Community Survey that doesn't go to everyone, but it's an annual survey and it does ask ancestry, but race is used for civil rights enforcement. Let's just be clear. So is Hispanic ethnicity, right? To see language access, all of these things. But yeah, just recognizing when you mark more than 1, you don't know what's going to happen with your data. In fact, Louisiana is deciding that they're going to count as Black only those who say Black or Black and white, but nothing else. And it's in court right now. But the bottom line is you will go into the 2 or more box. I don't know if there's other additional questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. I have a question myself as well. I was thinking about, one thing that stood out to me was from your presentation was when you were showing how, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, in your work trying to secure funding, the response from
A program
doing
office.
intersectional work, analytical laziness was what you were told.
Yep.
How do you navigate? What can you share in terms of with your experiences and perspective? How can we navigate those challenges, that resistance when we try to secure funding, when we try to secure resources to promote the work, to be in the work with communities and
Don't
others?
let anyone shake your confidence. So say, for instance, I got discouraged. Oh, this stuff, people don't like it. You know what? Right now, I have 6 active grants from foundations, from federal funding agencies, and more importantly, changing the conversation where we're collecting and how we're being accountable. Had I just said, oh, I'm going to give up because, and I can show you many of these grants I have now, they had a precursor 10 years ago where I wasn't told analytical laziness, but just like this was not good. I mean, I have lots of quotes from the rejections and piles of don't give up, continue forward, find co-conspirators. I would not have been able to publish that article in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, which is now like a highly cited article using intersectional analysis, if it hadn't been for a co-conspirator who's not a person of color. This is a colleague, her name's Melissa Bender. She and I had students and we said, even though we don't have the funding, let's do this work any old way. And guess what? Wonderful things happen. Alden Moore's calls it liberation capital, right? Like resource-starved scholars, right? get together and still do something meaningful and community facing. So I would say when you get rejected, don't let it shake your confidence. Continue, create your posse. And there are co-conspirators out there of every color, every class background, every gender that are also committed to the same values that you may have about producing new knowledge for action. So I would never get discouraged. Gosh knows that I would not be here. None of us would be here if we let people who are discounting our work shape what we do next. It's actually inspiration. I almost got inspired because I was like, wow, what are they so scared we're going to learn that you're trying to call it lazy and tell me not to do this work? Why are you so scared of that? I find it very interesting. And another question is like, I've also had that response for people who say, oh, if you're going to disaggregate Latinos by race, that's divisive, or by national origin as well. And I'm like, so you're saying that remaining blind or, not seeing and not recognizing differences in treatment, discrimination is being in solidarity with our community? No. So yeah, it's just, again, reminding people that we're not here to make people feel paralyzed and angry. We're here to create a community around liberation for everyone. Not all or none. Latinidad means all or none.
I think that is just the perfect and beautiful way to end as we wrap up. And you've left us feeling encouraged, motivated to continue reflecting on what this means for us individually and together as a community. So I really want to, sincerely, from all of us here, want to thank you from the Center for Ethnic Studies Research, University of Pittsburgh. We thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, for joining us.
Mil gracias. And I hope you all send letters to the Office of Management and Budget. And like I said, all of that is on my faculty webpage, where you can send letters and emails, and just saying that, yeah, we should not conflate race and ethnicity. These are different things.
Yes, just truths and truths. Thank you.
Hasta la próxima.
Hasta la próxima. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you everyone. The next concurrent session will begin around will begin at 1:45. And so we'll see you there. Thank you everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. We'll be in communication and touch. I look forward to it. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you very much.